刚才看到你很高兴啊。
Pleasure to see you again. It's been too long. It's been too long.
他们说是刚才跟我说，这个菲舍博士看起来是更绅士，我看着这个，
Oh my goodness. As you see, I took my necktie. After 6 months in lockdown, I can't put on a necktie anymore.
哦，怎么样？要不我也把领带给解下来？
No, it's perfect. Super elegant.
行，确实看到你非常高兴，我这个一直在担心你那边情况到底怎么样。现在看起来看你的状况，我觉得非常高兴，非常好。
I reciprocate the pleasure. It's great to see you, and it's great to see you and all the colleagues at the National Museum looking really well
啊，
and full of energy as always.
首先应该祝贺您这个馆这个重新开馆，这是个好事情，是个好消息。
Well, thank you so very much. You can't believe, and of course you can believe because you've gone through the same thing, what it feels like to open the doors again and to have visitors back. Visitors, for you, for us, that's our lifeblood. We are there to share the collections with them. And it's nice to have them back also in person and not only on the screen.
是的，看到经过长时间的闭馆以后啊，看到这个观众第一批观众进来，不管他是男的、女的、高的、矮的、胖的、瘦的、漂亮的、丑的，我都希望拥抱一下。
Yeah, you're right. And so, what are do you have limits on the number of people you can let in, or are you already so secure that there are no limits to the numbers of visitors?
没有完全解除。其实我们经历了3个阶段，就是在春节这个除夕到这个4月30号期间，我们完全闭馆嘛。5月1号正式开馆，最初5月1号到6月初的时候，我们大概每天控制在3000人。但是6月份有一段时间，北京重新又发现了这个疫情以后呢，我们控制在1000人。到了7月份以后，我们平时放宽到5000人的样子。现在到周末的时候，我们大概是8000人的这个数额的限制。
That's fantastic. We are still with 2,000, so we're very careful, and we visitors enter the museum, and then there's one route, a one-way route through galleries only on ground floor. It's only on ground floor. It's not on the first floor. But they can see 9,000 objects on that route. And it is because you don't have to think about where to go because we tell you where you have to go. It frees the mind and you suddenly rediscover the objects as never before.
我完全相信你说的，因为大英博物馆在这个中国的公众心目中啊，有非常高的知名度。我们2家博物馆的合作呢，应该说是每一次新的这个合作的进展都会引起很大的这种社会的关注，媒体也很关注。比如说我们合作举办过很多的这种影响很大的展览，比如说2012年的6月22号到2013年的1月6号，我们跟维多利亚和埃伯特的维 A 博物馆联合在北京办了瓷之韵大英博物馆、英国国立维多利亚与埃伯特博物馆藏瓷器精品展。这个展览呢，应该说是吸引了35万多观众，影响非常大。这是国外的高品质外销瓷第一次在中国展出。那么2017年的3月1号到5月31号，那么我们举办了来自贵馆的这个大英博物馆100件展品中的世界史展览。这展览了76天，我看了一下，观众数是34万人，影响非常大。所以大英博物馆在中国公众心目中，既有比较很高的地位，也有很大的影响，大家都很关注。包括我们现在这个连线，我们即将推出这个藏品的介绍，观众都很期待，希望能看到大英的珍藏。
Well, it's very kind of you to say this, and of course we completely reciprocate. For us, it's been a great privilege and a great pleasure to work together with you and the colleagues in the National Museum. It's always been a cooperation on a very high level of professionalism and shared interest. And I think also shared interest for our audience, for our visitors who come to the museum to encounter the collections, to encounter the objects and learn something and be inspired for their life. Because I think that's, and I know this from the many conversations that you and I have had over the last years, I think we really believe that encountering collections, be it in the permanent galleries or be it in the temporary exhibition spaces, allows you to make key experiences for your life when you connect with the past, when you connect with other cultures, and thus, other parts of the world that we all share. And being able to do this together for us has been a wonderful journey of discovery and of friendship. And I very much look forward to continuing this in the future as soon as the pandemic is gone, we can all move safely again.
我完全同意费舍尔馆长的这个观点。我们两个馆2005年的时候，我们签了第一个合作链接备忘录。2015年的时候，我们续签了一下，这个链接备忘录。那么2019年，我们出了外国藏中国文物丛书大英博物馆卷，那么在中国国内的文博界引起了很大的反响。我们前段时间又在线续签了合作链接备忘录。我觉得这链接备忘录我们越来越实，越来越有一些具体的一些工作。我希望我们在这方面合作，能越来越有更多的成效，更大的影响。
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it's wonderful to see that all the colleagues in the British Museum are very excited about our cooperation, our long-term cooperation. And of course, we should also mention that regularly we have the great pleasure of welcoming colleagues from the National Museum who decide to come here over the summer and work with us. And for us here at the British Museum, that is always a very special moment when we can share experience, we can share knowledge, we can look at how we go about exhibitions, how we go about research, how we go about digital. So I think our cooperation has really created a wonderful basis for colleagues to profit mutually, and also to share results of research. And of course, you had this very impressive colloquium in 2019, where I had the opportunity to learn much more about the great development of museums in China, which is very impressive indeed, together with colleagues from other parts of the world. And looking to the future, obviously, I think there are many areas where we can simply continue and expand the exchange for the profit, in the end, for the profit of our audiences. And of course, your audiences, like our audiences, are international audiences. Here in the British Museum, the fastest growing group of visitors from abroad is the Chinese. So on a normal day, before the pandemic, walking into the British Museum, and you remember this from your visits, this is a global community you are in, and Chinese are extremely present. And I'm very happy to say, not only in the China section, of course, that is one of the glories of our museum, but also in all the other areas, Egypt and Greece and India and Europe. So it's really, I think, on all levels, there are close ties. And I think this partnership with the National Museum is really highlighting how closely we are connected.
这个确实是，我也在大英博物馆也看到很多的亚洲面孔的观众，非常多，这确实是一个特点。但是相比之下呢，中国国家博物馆，这个从产品的结构来讲的话，外国的文物很少，外国藏品很少。那么这是我们的一个短板。从这个观众结构来讲，我们国外的观众相对来讲占比也是比较少。所以怎么能够解决这个问题，这也是我一直是希望能够推进在这方面做些工作。所以我们专门设立了一个部门，叫这个外国文物部，我们希望能扩大对这个外国文物的征集。那么我最近也注意到你们收藏了这个日本艺术家葛饰北斋的作品，这个确实很令我羡慕。据报道说你们那个大英博物馆收藏的这个葛饰北斋的作品超过1000幅，这个我知道做好这方面工作需要方方面面努力，我很想了解一下，费舍尔的馆长在这方面有什么这个好的做法和经验，给我们介绍一下。
Yes, this is a very fascinating story, obviously. And I think it's fascinating for each and every museum to understand how objects ended up in the museum. And of course, we both know that museums have actually really started to acquire works only in the 19th century. Before that, museums were repositories of collections that were donated, basically. So from the 19th century on, museums themselves have developed strategic collecting approaches, thinking about what they want to highlight, what they want to focus on. And I think the best collections are those which were created by people who really knew how to make decisions and choices and say, we want to strengthen this part of the collection. We're not going to look at this or the other because this is what our main focus is. And of course, the British Museum has benefited from people who've been passionate about other cultures and who were curious and who had also the stamina to go out and do archaeological research, do excavations, or engage with other communities. And I think what we need to keep in mind is that collections always grow out of the passion of some people, the knowledge, the expertise, the love of some people who want to know, who want to bring together groups of objects and groups of works that allow future generations to show what a region in the world, what a certain period in history looked like. And that, with all the vicissitudes and you have to have luck too, and you have to attract collections, in the end creates what we know of our collections, either in the National Museum, which of course has that function of representing the nation, major National Museum. And the British Museum, there's a joke about the British Museum's name. Why is it called British Museum? Because the British part in the museum is not that big. It's quite important too. But it's really a museum about world culture and 2 million years of human history, spanning the entire globe. And for us, and I come back to our cooperation, it is very important that more and more we can enhance the access to this collection, that we can share this collection. So being able to work with you and having objects travel to the National Museum, where you put up beautiful shows with a great audience, is extremely important. It's a vital part of our activity.
对，我觉得大家经常说的一句话，就是或者是大英博物馆对自己的这个使命的或愿景的一个描述，就是世界文明的荟萃之地。确实是各方面的各个国家，东西方的，发达国家、发展中国家的这种文化都在这里面，有一种呈现，有一种交流，有一种荟萃。但是我也注意到您最近有一个接受媒体采访的时候有一句话。说是大英博物馆创始人汉斯·斯隆爵士，因其奴隶主的身份，他的半身的雕像已经换了个位置。您当时说汉斯·斯隆曾经是一名奴隶主，我们已经把他放下了神坛，我们不能隐瞒任何事情。当涉及到历史的时候，忠于事实绝对是至关重要的。我们追求的目标是还原和直面我们共同的复杂的，有的时候是非常痛苦的历史。我确实想着了解一下，你当时谈这个话的时候是一个什么样的真实的想法
Well, first of all, I must say that we took the bust of Hans Sloane, which sat on a pedestal in what we call the Enlightenment Gallery. And of course, at the National Museum, you remember the Enlightenment exhibition. So what we do in this gallery is to show the period between, say, 1680 and 1820, when, from a European point of view, scholars, researchers would set out to, from their vantage point, to explore the world and to come up with new forms of thinking, of research, of verifying results, of, let's say, the relation to truth, which is based on facts, corroborated facts, on categorizing the whole world of knowledge in a new way. And Hans Sloane, who was born in 1660 and died in 1753, was part of that movement. He was a medical doctor, a natural scientist. He was a friend of Isaac Newton, and in fact, he became his successor as the head of the Royal Society here in London. Sloane brought together the biggest private collection, the biggest encyclopedic private collection which has been created. And at the end of his life, he offered this collection to the British Parliament, saying, you can have it, you have to buy it, but I sell it at a very low price. So there was a strong aspect of donation involved in this, provided that you make it accessible to everybody. He says, to the studious and the curious, the specialists and the general public, free of charge. And that you keep that collection together, because that collection, which covers natural history, human history, and which also comprised a huge library, which then became the British Library, covered all areas of knowledge in his understanding. Now, as a young man, so Hans Sloane is a physician, a very important physician of his time, a very important scholar, a very important collector, and a very important benefactor. And what we have done now, coming out of research that we have done over these last years on the history of our own collection. So where did people collect the objects? How were they collected? How did they enter the museum? Because we need clarity and transparency on these questions. In this context, we also wanted to highlight that Sloane, as many people of his time, was a slave owner, and that he owned shares in companies that traded slaves, that brought enslaved Africans from West Africa to the Caribbean and to what is today the US. So this, taking him off the pedestal, putting him in a showcase, and putting, as we do in museums, we work with objects. So we argue, if you like, with objects and then explain the objects. And this is what we did. We put Sloane in the context of his time. And aside from his many merits, we also wanted to highlight for our audiences those aspects of Sloane that for us today are unacceptable. For us, it's obviously a profound breach of all human rights to enslave people, which, by the way, is not only a problem of us, it's also a problem of the present. So here we are with Hans, who's a key figure in the history of our museum, but with a fuller historical appraisal of who he was, what he did. And I think it's in relation to this that I said we have to have a dedication to truthfulness, which is to say we have to address all the things that we are aware of and that we can research. And we have to understand that all our histories are complex histories which have difficult sides and, as I said, at times painful sides. And I think it's important as a community address these questions and engage in dialogue with audience around the world. Those who come to the museum and those who engage with the museum from afar via digital forum. That's the background of Hans Sloane. It's very important to understand. If not put him away, we just put him in a different context within the Enlightenment Gallery.
谢谢费舍尔馆长把这个情况给我们做了一个介绍。确实，直面历史是需要非常巨大的一个勇气。这个是一个，因为是报道里面我看到了，感兴趣，所以我就了解一下。其实我也很欣赏大英博物馆历年来的这个展览。我的同事，我平常也是经常上大英博物馆的这个官网上来看一下。我同事每次去呢，他到大英去参观的时候，也会带来很多的信息。那么关于大英博物馆在展览的设计啊、陈列方面的一些经验，确实我经常说，大英博物馆确实是人类文明的荟萃之地，在这方面名不虚传。那么人类历史本身就是一幅这种不同文明相互交流啊、借鉴呐、融合的这么一幅历史，所以我很希望在文明交流方面跟大英博物馆有更多的合作，比如说联合策展呐、这种文物保护啊，具体来说，比如中国国家博物馆有很多的肖像画，就是传统的肖像画，大英博物馆有很多西方的肖像画。如果能够在这方面做个展览，我们双方观众在这方面都能了解对方的馆藏，通过这么一个合作，增进我们相互之间的这种文化的交流、相互理解，我觉得是个非常好的事情。我也希望在这方面，听一下这个费舍尔馆长的这个意见和建议，我相信很多观众也很感兴趣。
I love this idea of working together to offer the opportunity to have a dialogue between cultures. And I think really that is, in our present world, that is really key. Why? Well, because obviously through 4,000 or 5,000 years of history, with states growing bigger and bigger, city-states, kingdoms, empires have marked the history of the last 5,000 years in many parts of the world and have triggered many of the developments and innovations that have led up to the present. And at the same time today, I think we are witnessing that this idea of a global world comes under increased reassessment, criticism, scrutiny. We see nationalisms become stronger again, and perhaps a certain tendency of countries, isolating themselves from others. And I believe strongly that this movement, which comes way out of the past, of an ever-growing connection globally, is irreversible. It will grow. It will become ever more important. It will mark our lives ever more profoundly. And of course, technology plays an important part in that. But as we see today, as we're witnessing in these years, history doesn't go down one route as expected. It takes turns. It goes backwards, perhaps, at least in our perception, to then take another leap. So I think we are in a fascinating period of time with a lot of new challenges, with a lot of new opportunities. And I think, Director Wang, the possibility to work together, the colleagues from the National Museum and the colleagues from the British Museum, is a huge chance to have an impact on this development. And as you suggest, what we are able to show is that there are many interconnections between cultures. Not only are there many interconnections between cultures, these interconnections, the interconnectedness of cultures, has actually driven the development of humankind. And I think our museums, with the depth of collections, and that means also the depth of history that you can showcase in Beijing, that we can showcase in London, really makes us understand that. But we have to bring this out. It's not self-evident. As always, objects encapsulate a lot of stories, but we have to tell these stories. We have to narrate them. So your suggestion, I think, is wonderful, to bring together works from different cultures. In this case, you say two, can be more, and understand how each culture has actually, take portraits as an example, conceived of the individual. Who is the individual? What is an individual? How does the individual express herself or himself? And how is the individual integrated into society? And of course, we will find out that there are different ways of thinking about this, different ways of thinking about the interior world of an individual, different ways of thinking about social responsibility. And bringing paintings or portraits together, and that can be sculptures, can be many things, would highlight that. It would allow us to go from one to the other, to bridge the distance, if you like, and in bridging it, translating from one culture to the other. And I think that is really the key task of our institutions, to offer to our visitors that possibility of engaging in dialogue and offering translations between cultures.
Welcome to the British Museum. It's a great pleasure to take you round our galleries and to show you some of the most famous, some of the most beautiful, and some of the most fascinating objects in our collection. But before we do that, I would like to have a look at this inscription, which is placed right when you come into the museum, into the Great Court, this imposing space at the center, at the heart of the museum, with this enormous roof. And what you see here in the ground is from a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson, one of the greatest poems of the United States Kingdom in the 19th century. And it says, "And let thy feet millenniums hence be set in midst of knowledge." And it is addressing you, the visitors, inviting you to engage with the objects, the cultures from around the world, from the depth of history, the depth of time, and to discover what speaks to your heart, what speaks to your mind, what is really meaningful for you. And then take it with you as you move on for millenniums hence, and use it for yourself, for your friends, for your family. Discuss it, debate it, think about it, dream about it, and just make it your own. Let me show you one of the most popular, one of the most visited objects in the British Museum. It's a Rosetta Stone right in front of us here in the showcase. And it has a fascinating story to tell. In fact, it has many fascinating stories to tell. It was put up in 196 BCE at a temple, probably in Sais. It tells us about the temple setting up a cult for the pharaoh, the young Ptolemy V. And it tells us the story in 3 different types of script. At the top, you have hieroglyphs, which is the ancient traditional writing system of Egypt. In the middle, you have the same text written in Demotic, which was the everyday writing system of script. At the bottom, you have the same text, this time in Greek. The stone was seized in 1801. In 1802, it entered the British Museum. And today it sits right in the center of the Grand Egyptian Gallery. As soon as the Rosetta Stone entered the British Museum, copies were made, and they were distributed among the learned societies of Europe and Northern America, triggering a race to decipher the hieroglyphs. In 1822, the young French Egyptologist Champollion published his book on the hieroglyphs. That was the moment when suddenly, with the deciphering of the hieroglyphs, all of the ancient Egyptian past became accessible. Scholars could read the texts, buildings, papyri, and that exploded our knowledge and understanding of ancient Egypt. So this stone tells a very complex story, mixing religion, faith, politics, culture, the understanding of the past, and the way we can build bridges between languages and between epochs. It's all about translation, and that is what actually the museum is about. It helps you to translate cultures from other regions, cultures from other times, into your own language, and allows you to activate them as your own resource, as your own cultural resource, wherever they come from. We're standing here next to a lamassu. The lamassu is a winged bull, sometimes a lion, with a human head, wearing a crown, and around the crown we see horns, indicating that this is a divinity. Lamassu stood at the entrances to citadels and palaces in the Assyrian Empire, in palaces of the king, to protect the ruler. This lamassu was excavated in Kosovo at the capital of Sargon II, who ruled from 721 to 705 BC. And it tells you something about the power, the might of this empire and its rulers. There's something very special about this one, the muscle, and that's what I would like to show you right here. As is very often the case with Assyrian sculpture and reliefs, you have inscriptions telling us what this is about, who put them up, under whose rule they were created, who commissioned them, and so on and so forth. So this is highly official court art, and it is to communicate that this is the place of the ruler and that he has the support of the gods. But of course, all this is placed right in the middle of daily life. And it's daily life that we find a very touching trace of when we look closer at the plinth. And as you see here, just next to one of the hoofs of the bull, and you can admire how finely sculpted these massive sculptures were. But right here, you have scratched into the stone a game board. And this must have been scratched into the stone by the sentinels who had to guard the entrance to the citadel. And doing this day in, day out, they must have been bored to pieces. So what did they do? Well, they were used to playing this game, and this is a very ancient game. It's been played in Mesopotamia since 2500 BCE. So these sentinels said, let's have a game. Nobody's watching, we're on our own. They scratched the game board into the rock, into the stone, and had a go at it. And this tells you something about the collection of the British Museum. You have grand art that speaks of empires, conquest, high art, culture, sophistication. And you also have those simple objects, the traces of the human hand, of everyday life, of, as we would call it, normal people, not the rulers, not those who would call the shots and decide on the fate of the empire. But you just had to make a living every day, like the sentinels. And that is a monument to those sentinels that we have right here at the foot of this giant sculpture. In 2017, we renovated our biggest gallery, the Houghton Gallery, and added digital content, digital technology to enhance our visitors' experience and to make them engage in even more ways with the objects in the collection. The following film will take you right into the center of a beautiful 17th century Chinese scroll. also try to produce films that tell the stories, the many stories of the objects in our collection. Let me introduce you to my colleague, Jessica Harrison Hall, who's now going to talk about the subtle differences in Ming porcelain.
Hello, I'm Jessica Harrison Hall and I'm a specialist in Ming ceramics, and welcome to my corner. Today I'm going to talk to you about Ming ceramics. The Ming dynasty in China runs from 1368 to 1644, and I have before me a selection of blue and white ceramics that were made in Jingdezhen between 1368 and 1644. This saucer dish was made at the time of the Hongwu Emperor. Now, he conquered the Mongols and established the Ming dynasty in 1368, and he has an extraordinary life story. At one stage he was so poor he had to beg for land to bury his parents, and yet by the time he was 40 he was son of heaven and ruling all of China. And during his reign, supplies of cobalt to make the underglazed blue design was interrupted, and so blue and white wares during his reign have a much weaker tone because they used the imported cobalt quite sparingly or mixed it with local cobalt. So what we're looking at here is a rather beautiful saucer. Originally it would have had a cup set in the centre here, and it has a very stiff bracketed edge, and this is reminiscent of metalwork. We find these dishes made in silver and gold with this same bracket-lobed rim. And then inside, can you see you've got these lotuses that are shown sometimes from above and sometimes in profile. And what's particularly clever is you can see that there are some areas where they left white around the petal, and that creates a kind of three-dimensionality to the flower. So each of these flowers have been painted with a very fine brush, and you can pick out all the different details in the flower. It's really quite exquisite. The second ceramic that we're going to look at was made in the Yongle period. Now this is the high point for blue and white Ming porcelain. He ruled between 1403 to 24, and he was the emperor that moved the capital from Nanjing north to Beijing. And he instigated a real change at Jingdezhen where these porcelains were produced. So you get porcelains made with a much finer prepared body clay and more beautiful glaze. And you can see, if you look closely at the flowers here, which are all peonies, that the actual blue is used to sculpt the flower. So there are certain areas that are white, certain areas that are pale blue, and certain areas that are dark blue. And if we look very, very closely, you can see some which are black, where the blue has really come all the way through the glaze. So one of the things about Yongle period, early 15th century blue and white porcelain, is that you have these sculpted flowers. Each of the leaves makes sense in the pattern, and these particular flowers have these crinkle-edged leaves. And you may be wondering, why is it in this shape? And that's because, again, it's copying a metalwork form. It's not natural in ceramic to have these little hooks on the top of the handle, and you have to imagine that originally it would have had a cover, and that from the knob on the top of the cover that would have connected a chain to the top of the handle. And this strut here is entirely unnecessary for the ceramic, but would have helped support the spout in the gold original. And when we turn around and look at the base of the handle, you've got these three tiny, almost like nails, these studs, which would have fixed the metal handle to the body. It's very, very beautifully painted, and you can see it has a much whiter glaze surrounding the blue than the Hongwu piece. This is probably one of the most precious Ming ceramics that we have on the table today. Moving on to our third example, this was made in the mid-15th century. And what's interesting about this is you start to get fabulous designs from woodblock prints. So if we start off on this example, we begin with this building here with these typical Chinese roof edges that are upturned at the edge. Inside, you can see a scholar waiting with a bottle of wine, and his servant is pointing out to the procession of people who are coming to see him. The first servant is carrying a sword over his shoulder, and the second has a musical instrument wrapped in silk called a chin. After them come the scholars themselves, mounted on horseback, with these fabulous black hats that have these wings at the side. Each one has a rank badge on his chest, and their horses are bedecked with fabulous bridles and saddles, trimmed with a pom-pom on the nose. Behind the three scholars, we have two more servants. One who is bringing a shoulder pole with two picnic baskets attached. Each of the layers here would have contained different delicacies, all contained within stacking lacquer boxes. And his friend behind him comes with two wine jars full of delicious wine for their feast. And they're followed right at the end with another servant carrying a stack of books. And then the scene comes to an end with these sort of clouds. That's how we know it's the beginning and the end of the scene. So how were these made? They're fashioned from porcelain clay, thrown on a wheel, and then painted with cobalt oxide in solution, which when you paint it on appears black. After you've let it dry, you cover it with a clear glaze and then fire it at a high temperature. These are fired in wood-fueled kilns that snake up the side of mountains in the southern part of China, near the city of Jingdezhen. And so, because of this snaking form that undulates up the hillside, they're referred to as dragon kilns. You might be wondering what the jar is for. It's effectively a large container for wine. So originally it would have had a cover. And we see these in paintings sitting on the floor. And from this, wine would have been taken and then put into smaller vessels like this decanter or bottles. The next item on the table is this box, which was made for the Longqing emperor, who really only ruled for 5 or 6 years, between 1567 and 72. So this beautiful square box is interesting because it has this pattern of 2 dragons. You can see the heads here, and then the curling bodies that run all the way through with the 5-clawed feet. And they're chasing this flaming pearl amongst the clouds. And then the edges, each edge has got a different dragon around the edge on the 4 sides. And then underneath we've got a box with 4 compartments. Again, each of the compartments is outlined with a blue line. The edges are unglazed, and then inside they're filled with glaze. And each of the edges has a roundel with a dragon, rather like the robes of an emperor. These come from textile designs, and there are 12 of them around the outside. The first piece that we've come across in this selection that has a rain mark and yet we're always talking about mark and period Ming porcelain. The rain marks themselves are generally made up of 6 characters, sometimes of 4. The first 2 have the name of the dynasty, Great Ming. The second 2 have the name of the reign period, and then the last 2 are year and made in. So it's made in the year of, and then the particular emperor's name. Blue and white wasn't invented in the Ming dynasty. Blue and white goes much further back in Chinese history, and the first blue and white porcelains were made during the Yuan era. That's 1280 to 1368. And when we think of blue and white, we don't think of Yuan blue and white, we think of Ming blue and white, because that's the era in which blue and white porcelain came to Europe, first of all through the Portuguese and later the Dutch and the English. And when the blue and white arrived in Europe, it transformed the way people dined and it transformed interiors. If you think of laying out a table with pewter and with wood, it's all very dark, and the ceramics at the time generally had lead glazes. So in Europe they would have been greens and browns and rather dull colours. And then along comes something like this dish, which was made for export and shipped in large quantities to Holland and Portugal and England. And it would have transformed interiors by the light reflecting off the dish. So you can imagine a more multicoloured interior, and the patterns too were much more interesting. So very quickly in Europe people started copying these designs at all sorts of ceramics manufacturers right across Europe. Here we have a piece which was produced for the export market right at the end of the Ming dynasty in 1643. This has got a bracket-lobed rim like the first dish that we looked at, but it's much coarser. In the centre you've got the crow with the open mouth, or the bird with the open mouth, this giant tree peony, and then in the carvetto this sort of panel design with alternating flowers and lingja fungus. Now these are a kind of fungus or mushroom which bestowed immortality on an individual. If we turn it over, we can see that it's been rather roughly made. It's been fired on its foot ring and has a lot of grit adhering to it. And in the centre you can see these chatter marks, which are like the spokes on the wheel of a bicycle. That's very typical of this late material. This came from a shipwreck discovered in the 1980s, and it's lain at the bottom of the South China Sea for 300 years. And that's why when you look at it, it has a very matte feel to it. We can't see the same kind of glossy glaze that we see on the earlier Ming pieces. Discovered in the 1980s and was sold to the museum in 1985. It was one of 23,000 pieces on board.
Thank you for watching this brief introduction to the British Museum. If you liked it, please visit our Chinese language website. There you will also find a collection online with many entries on famous objects in Chinese. And please follow us on Weibo and WeChat and discover our bespoke content. We very much hope to welcome you to the British Museum soon.
感谢您的这个参与，希望我们能够在不久的将来呢，实现这个线下会晤，更共同商讨一下后疫情时代我们合作和发展的一些新的方向和趋势。谢谢费舍尔馆长，再见。
Thank you so very much for having me. It was great talking to you. All the best.
So see you then.